Hey everyone, welcome to another live roundtable edition of DevOps Unbound. For those of you not familiar, DevOps Unbound is a every 2 weeks, bi-weekly video program where we discuss just about any topic related to DevOps that kind of tickles our fancy. It's hosted by myself, Alan Schimmel, that's me, CEO of Techstrong Group, and my buddy Mitchell Ashley, who's CTO and principal analyst here at Techstrong. And we have a rotating cast of panel members who bring unbelievable experiences and views and everything else to the table, and we're lucky to have them. However, every 4 to 6 weeks, we do a special edition of DevOps Unbound, and we call it the Live Roundtable, where in addition to our amazing panel, we have an amazing live audience, and we look to them to help drive the discussion here for 50 or 55 minutes or so. It's when it works right, it's great because you out there, and I see people logging on and saying where they're from. You know, we've got New York City already and Birmingham over in the UK. That's exciting. Los Angeles. What else? Oakham, UK. We get people from all over the world. And I love when you all log in and tell us where you're coming from. But once the discussion starts, we really want you to add to it. You could ask a question, you could make a comment, give your opinion, what have you. To do so, you use this communication window that we see in our big marker system. And for most of you, that is primarily under chat. And then within chat is the public section of chat. If you put a question in there, it is public. Everyone can see it who's on board today. You may get another member, another attendee answering your question or chiming in. You may get someone from our panel answering or chiming in, or we may just read your question out loud here and have the panel, pontificate on it as well. So that's a great way of interacting with us. Another great way is if you look at that communication window, and to the right of chat is Q&A. And Q&A obviously is Q&A. It's question and answer. And someone already asked, these are questions that you want to direct directly to the panel, and we bring it up. And looks like someone already answered the question that was in there about being recorded. Yes, it is being recorded. So in any event, you can ask questions in Q&A, and we will, again, we can answer them right in that window, or we could bring it up to the whole team. We do have a great panel today, and I want to introduce you to them. But before we do, I would be remiss if I didn't call out our friends at Tricentis. You know, we've been doing DevOps Unbound, both live roundtables like this and recorded video sessions for like 2 years now, I think. And we are thrilled from day one, even before day one. They helped design the show with us. Our friends at Tricentis have been just the ultimate partner to do this with. We collectively are able to get some of the top people in their fields to come on here. We do some great discussions, and a big shout out to Tricentis for being a stalwart partner on DevOps Unbound. Also, another big announcement for this show is we have recently taken all of our DevOps Unbound episodes, and I think, there's 35 or more of them, and we've converted them to a podcast. Unfortunately, they're not video, so you don't get the full recording like this or the full video recordings that you'll see, let's say, on techstrong.tv. You can look them up, play them there anywhere. But if you're into your Apple podcast or your Spotify or wherever you listen to regular podcasts, if you look up DevOps Unbound, you can now listen to these while exercising, driving, walking, or however you listen to your podcast normally. So do us a favor. We We're looking for feedback. We're looking for what the audience likes. If podcasts are your thing, please do subscribe to the DevOps Unbound podcast, which is really recordings of these shows. Okay. We've got a lot of great people from all over the world here: Sri Lanka, Germany, Azerbaijan. All right. Let me introduce you, though, to our panel today. I'm going to start off with, because he's on my screen on the left-hand corner, and it's none other than Paul Bruce. I'm going to let Paul tell you about himself. Paul, welcome, and if you wouldn't mind a little introduction.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and also thanks, Tricentis. I work for Tricentis, so my name is Paul Bruce. My pronouns are he, him. I work as we, us in most cases, in the sense that it's really a collaboration. A lot of work I do. I'm head of incubation there at Tricentis. I'm also an organizer of the Boston DevOps Meetup and DevOps Days Boston, and I've been doing that for years, and that's been really beneficial. I also work on a nonprofit behind that, and I'm the Ollie Fest chair, Ollie Fest, Observability Fest. Now the fourth year in 2023, we're coming back in person around the world. So I do a lot of that stuff, and I'm really grateful for these kind of panel conversations.
Excellent. Paul, thank you. And thank you for all you do. I mean, it's, Paul gives a lot of his time to the community, and much appreciated.
Yeah.
Next up, I want to introduce Dory, and I hope I pronounced this right.
It's Exterman.
Exterman. Dory, welcome. Dory joins us today, I believe, from Tel Aviv. But Dory, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
So hi to you all. My name is Dory Exterman. I'm from Tel Aviv. I'm chief evangelist at Incredibuild. I was CTO at Incredibuild for more than a decade. All of you who are not familiar with Incredibuild, Incredibuild is a market leader in build and dev acceleration, mostly focused on the C++ ecosystem with largest studios, game studios in the world, embedded devices, everything which is heavy-duty DevOps, CI/CD kind of stuff being accelerated with our technologies. So that's my passion, technology, and where technology meets real people and real use cases. And I'm excited to be here as part of this panel. Really nice having a live audience, and I'm waiting to discuss this important topic together with you.
Thank you, Dory. And no, we can never forget Ireland. So just a shout out to our friends from Ireland here. Our next panelist is frequent panelist here on DevOps Unbound, as well as a lot of the other Techstrong shows. She's also the co-host of Techstrong Women, which is another video series we produce at Techstrong TV. And by the way, it's also spun out now as its own standalone podcast. She's Tracy Reagan. Hey, Tracy, welcome. Tell people a little bit about you.
Thank you, Alan. And yes, I'm having a blast on Techstrong Women. So for all of you out there, tune in. We don't talk about women in particular. We talk about technology, and we just happen to be women. So I am the CEO of Deploy Hub. Deploy Hub is an evidence catalog. We gather supply chain evidence across the pipeline and create a comprehensive end-to-end view of your organization's security profile. Before that, I ran a company called OpenMake Software that also participated in the build management space. I have sat on the OpenSSF board. I helped start the Eclipse Foundation, and I currently am sitting on the CDF Technology Oversight Committee. So in my free time, I play with my dogs and ride horses.
Love it. And she does. All right. Last but not least, I referenced him earlier, but at least this time I'm not forgetting to introduce him. My longtime partner, colleague, Mitchell Ashley. Mitch, why don't you give him a little background?
Well, I think my role today is chief podcast URL paster, which I'm doing since we have so many new podcasts, and I'm happy to promote those. But yes, I'm CTO with Alan at Techstrong Group, and happy to be here, and as well as doing research with Techstrong Research. And I'm excited about this because I remember some old days with release management, and times have changed. A lot of good things happening.
It certainly has. It really has. We're going to jump into that. Hey, before we jump in, just a reminder, Paul's already put up a question there. Someone else is answering it. We appreciate it. But this is how we interact, guys. This is your show in the audience. You know, don't be shy. So today's show, though, is who needs release management anyway? Okay. Now, look, I started DevOps.com about 9 years ago. And one of the things, well, I heard several things when we first started DevOps.com, but one of them was, in an age of continuous delivery and automation, you didn't really need release management anymore because the release was sort of the anticlimax, right? If you did everything right, the release was just, yeah, someone pushed a button. They could push that button at any time, anywhere. And what's the big deal? You know, release management was going the way of the QA person, because we're not going to need QA either. We're going to automate QA, and there's no more QA jobs. Well, like most things, right? Reality doesn't really work that way. And we still have plenty of QA people out here, and QA's become more important than ever. And we still have release management. In fact, one could say release management has become even more important in a world of DevOps and CI/CD and all of these things. And instead of releasing twice a year or once a quarter, we're releasing 10 times a day. And how do you manage all that? So I'm going to start off with a big bah humbug. Who needs release management anyway? Of course we need release management. But that's me. What about you? Paul, you're never shy with an opinion. What do you think?
See, I was gonna be today, but now that you
Okay.
said that, I guess I can't. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
So I have only had the luxury of putting in maybe 3 RFCs, official RFCs, in various different jobs in my life. But I do know that the bigger an organization is, the more activities that are going on, right? The more you need to start to provide guardrails for those kind of things. And if you leave that to any one team or anyone, like at scale, that doesn't happen. So for small organizations, like super early startups, maybe some of this stuff doesn't apply, but it doesn't prevent you from listening to the following conversation to understand who you're selling to, maybe. And what you're selling into. So stay tuned, because we'll talk about those kind of things. But I think the biggest thing that release management addresses is that lots of moving parts. Unfortunately, in the past, it's injected a lot of human-driven motions and moments, which some of which are really necessary approvals. There are other teams need heads up, right? Things like infrastructure support, marketing. Oh yeah, legal, right? If you do something that needs to make a change to a EULA, how are you going to automate that, right? It's a human to human thing, and so it's necessary to have processes that capture or catch, based on maybe some requirements or some tagging, what should go through automation. But recently, there was a go-to video from Roy Osherov, and he shared this notion of pipeline-driven organizations. And before, I'll leave it to the rest of the conversation. But I think the notion is, these days, not everything can be automated. But if we don't flip or pivot our lens to go, nothing is automated by default, to by default, we have to ask the question, why isn't this thing in a process, has process enough where it produces machine-to-machine capable artifacts that can be automated? I think that it's not to answer it with, yes, everything can be, not even close, but to ask yourself, to put yourself up to the challenge to say, why isn't this the case? Because you end up with a lot of pauses and post latencies, because humans, they're out on vacation. Oops. So we have to have a clear process, but we also have to be able to figure out, of those processes, which ones not can be, but can't be automated, and then start to take that lens. And I think release management is at scale already a thing, right? So we need to apply that lens to release management pretty rigorously, and in order to modernize. So I'll stop there.
Dory, how about you?
Well, I think that first and foremost, it will always be a matter of someone needs to own and care. And for this entire area of releasing a software and managing the release of a software, as a CTO, I always wanted someone to be caring enough and responsible enough to make sure that the owners of the product will be able to focus on the content and not on the way that this content is delivered. I think that today it's even more crucial. This role is crucial because this role is exactly where a lot of innovation and there is a lot of impact on the entire organization, on quality, on the cadence of releases, on the ability to innovate, to add security, to add a lot of steps. One of the things that we see for 13 years, I'm helping release managers and DevOps managers kind of streamline their processes. When Incredible started 13 years ago, if a build would have taken you hours to run, then everything would have been very slow. Who broke the build? No one could have worked with build per commit, right? Or things like gated check-ins, whatever, because your build would have taken you 5 hours to run, right? With Agile now, people are moving towards that. Not everyone, by the way. I think that in microservices in some areas, yes, but you have a lot of enterprise software, very large pipelines that cannot move to gated or to build per commit, and still you have all the who broke the build resolution, etc. But I believe that automation is here. Everyone's trying to move that way as much as possible. But even if everything would be automated, no human hand, and I believe that we are far away from that era, still, I would love to have someone who will drive insights, who will be able to kind of raise the flags when there are risks, because these people have experience and knowledge and expertise, and sharing this knowledge and expertise across teams in an organization, it's really what makes quality and the risks, that your ability to plan. And when we are serving, as I said, Incredible, heavily the gaming, AAA gaming is heavily rely on faster iteration, especially when you're looking at all these races today for the metaverse, for the cloud streaming, for the better graphics, etc. And from the other hand, you have last year you have all these postponed releases, right? And you have this crunch time kind of culture that people are trying to avoid. So that's just part of where release managers are stepping in. Let's hear others, but I think that that's exactly the era where release managers can shine and innovate and bring more insights and risk analysis into the entire process.
Agreed. We got Matt had put a question over in the QA about kind of where does release management live? What department? Is it under IT or is it maybe under PMO or something like that? Tracy, you answered affirmatively. It's IT, but in different departments, right? Each team is kind of responsible for its own release management and release, if you will. I saw earlier in the chat someone said highly regulated business, they must do release management for Sarbanes-Oxley. And I hate doing things just for compliance sake, because behind the compliance, there should be a good reason why the compliance is asking for it. But is it, I always thought of it as purely an IT function. Mitch, what about you?
Reference Tracy. So it traditionally has been, I think, where release management gets very interesting is, yes, there's automated continuous deployment and delivery and some things that we can do that way. But most applications in my world are interrelated. You know, you have parallel interrelated work streams, workflows, where you may be releasing the mobile app, but there are 5 other things that need to happen in some sequence in other applications or data sources or services that you might be using. So maybe release management has changed, but I think it's a combination of what is the product management and the business expecting to be delivered, and then how do you orchestrate that across one or multiple teams. So Tracy, love to have you jump in.
Well, let's, sometimes these terms are broad. So if I break it down into what release management is in my world, we have first the compile and link process. And as Dory pointed out, historically, that has been really big builds that take 5-6 hours to run. And then we have the process of pushing that set of binaries out to end users. So there's kind of 2 parts of release management. This whole both sides have been pretty, I would say, violently disrupted over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. The idea of containers first changed release management, because what we said, oh, wow, this is a lot easier. I don't have to go and test my set of binaries on 7 different operating systems. I can create a container and isolate myself from all of that and make that process easier. That small change, it disrupted what we used to call the application release automation industry, because what those tools were doing is we were trying to hold together all the pieces and parts as you move the package across for the different operating systems. So now we have containers, we don't have to worry about that. It didn't really change the build part, though. We still had these big old fat massive builds that we were having to create and package and stick in a container. Now we've gone the next step, microservices. When we think about the big players, the Netflix, the Uber, the Facebook, they're not running big, giant, massive builds anymore. They're running, they create images for a service. And that's very small. But the problem is that we no longer do a static link. Now that means that in the big build, what we did is we created all these objects and we statically linked them all together in a set of executables or binaries, stuck them in some form of delivery module, container, for example. All of that was already linked. We didn't have to worry about linking at runtime. So where now release management tools are focused has to do with how do you track a logical application, because we used to build a logical application. How do you track that logical application, and how do you know what versions of the objects we are going to be consuming at runtime? So this has now created, pushed that observability industry. How are these containers and service talking to each other? They talk all via API, no more static linking. It is OS2 and on steroids. If you ever really played an OS2 and used really, dynamic linking, which nobody really was successful at, I don't think, that is what we're facing now. So we still need release management, but it has changed drastically in what we are managing. Those smaller containers create a new set of problems for us. In the beginning, the problem was a 5-hour build. Now it is, what the heck is talking to each other in our runtime environment? And how do we know why an application changed? I'm a support person. I get a call because the clothing store no longer works. I don't know why it doesn't work, because I'm the application team, but I didn't change anything. Something in the environment changed. So that is where release management is now going. Now, to answer the question, from what I see, each team does their own release management. Most of the time now it's pushed out to a Helm chart. In good practices, I believe that each service has its own Helm chart and has an independent workflow. This means that the IT area, they must start defining what those guardrails are, as Paul pointed out. You have to have guardrails. That's the compliance stuff that we don't really like to talk about, but now we're at that point where release management really has to do with defining a good scorecard, a compliance level scorecard, what each team needs to achieve. And that might even include starting to add some security parts to the process. Are you doing an image build? Are you or an image scan and creating an SBOM? If not, you better do it after your build, before you push it out. So it's just changing. Release management, as we used to do it, probably it's going to retire. It will retire. We're not going to continue doing 5 and 6 hour builds. People are going to decouple those massive monoliths and start running in a more agile microservice cloud-based technology.
There's a couple comments from Stephen and Emily that I think are.
Yeah, I was going to hop on that. Go, Paul.
So Stephen brings to the point that deployment or release are surely two separate IT things. Absolutely, and that's how they've been defined for the longest time. So not to convolute those things at all. Emily backs that up and says that they're moving the app through the life cycle. Pardon me. And I think these two, release doesn't start at build. It starts in the planning process. That also includes requirements and the thought process around what are we building and how are we delivering value to customers with minimizing risk. And after I get something for my throat, we should probably get on to talking about risk. So I'll let other people go.
Paul mentioned the value to customers. I think that one of the roles of the release manager is to look at both ways: the value to the customer, to the pipeline, to the deployments, to the customer satisfaction, which is a huge momentum today. Customer satisfaction. It's all about iteration time and my ability to iterate as fast as possible to release this bug or feature or whatever. And from the other hand is to care for the developers, who are the other customers of the release managers. And I think that in that perspective, you don't have anyone in the organization. If we move this position, you won't have anyone kind of caring for the technical depth that I believe that just, by turning agile, by inventing this world and this trend, things have started to change, in the industry. As part of being in the Credibuild for 13 years, when I was in conferences, 13 years ago, we really needed to educate people about, the time people are waiting for their build to finish. But just a few years after, Agile, CI/CD just kind of became a thing. And then there was the release manager with developers as customers. And one of the main critical, things that a release manager, I think, should be accounted for is the satisfaction of these customers in terms of the quality, in terms of the planning, in terms of the ability to meet crunch time, in terms of the ability to collaborate and make the communication possible between all multiple teams and bring this kind of focalizing everything together. So I think that's both ways. I think it's super important when a release manager sees that. And just to give you an example, one of the release managers, they can really turn up to be champions of their organization. One use case that we had is a release manager cutting down their unit test time from 45 minutes down to 1.2 minutes. 45 minutes down to 1.2 minutes. And when you achieve something like that, you really change the entire kind of pipeline, because it's like a factory, right? The version is kind of going through these stages. And once you're able not to wait 45 minutes, but only wait 1 minute for a stage in this pipeline, the entire manufacturing line is kind of changed. The entire way that developers are writing their code, not waiting for feedback, etc. And in this specific case, the same infrastructure or solution that this release manager was able to find for the release pipeline, he was able to also offer that for the entire development team. This was distributed computing, right? Everyone can use as many cores as they need, so they can run hundreds or thousands of tests in parallel instead of just running on the local machine. So in that perspective, allowing the developers to run the entire test suite in 1 minute instead of 45 minutes, both affect their work, but in the other hand, also affect the release pipeline, because once every developer runs the entire test suite, the release pipeline fails less. And that, drive the entire productivity.
Yeah, not to plug Tricentis too much, but I didn't wear my T-shirt. It's one of my favorite T-shirts because it's comfortable, but it's the one that all it says is speed changes everything, right? And it does. It specifically the speed of the build pipelines allow people not only faster feedback loops, but allows them to do smaller incremental changes. And Tracy mentioned a lot about Kubernetes, well, about containers, and mentioned Helm. And there are a lot. There's still a lot of software that is not SaaS, that is not cloud native, whatever you want to declare that as today. That is still binaries, right? There's still the traceability of exactly how many of your changes went into that matters. But what I remember from a couple of things that I looked at, just to get some context for this webinar, to kind of fresh my brain up about some things, especially around ITIL, I ran across a presentation from a guy named Salman Faizi, who kind of management consultant that has a background in this, and did a really good overview of release management, not only from the traditional perspective, but brought up back to the original point about there's a lot of moving things going on at any point in time in a larger organization. And he gets to a point where he's talking about the difference between service transition process, ITIL process, and stuff outside of the IT processes. And in a way, release and deployment, that's what those supporting processes are for. When I hear the word supporting process and transition, it reminds me of the work that I did over the past 5 years with the IEEE for 2675. We've got I think a DevOps Unbound with Sarah Baker and myself talking about why did we even bother with a standard in and around DevOps for high compliance organizations. And the transition process, as it was the first time that I was involved in thinking about the transition process, is a very critical part of this. Now, change management is another broad topic, but if we just focus on the transition, maybe that's where like containerization helps us transition safely, again, so that we don't have to test for 36 different operating systems. It helps us transition, hopefully safely. But going back to the plug about Tricentis, we see that there are plenty of situations where people are using Kubernetes, and there's a lot less of the traditional problems moving from package and deploy and then release to customers, which are two separate processes. But what they're doing is they're not properly putting in what typically would be considered longer feedback loops within that transition between the package and deploy versus the release to actual users. In fact, the DevOps diagram, the typical populist DevOps diagram, it's so wrong. The stages are out of whack because it says something to the effect of, we're going to release this and then we're going to deploy it. I'm sorry, what? It's a dev-centric perspective to say, I'm going to release. What they're saying is, I'm going to release my code to somebody else and throw it over the wall, and then they're going to deploy it for me, right? So there's a lot of, even deep-seated in the modern DevOps stuff, there's a lot of deep-seated assumption that all we're really talking about is this myopic little group over here called developers or the people who are responsible for building the code. And it's not that test is separate from that, right? And QA and test are not the same thing in my head. The QA is a process, just like the transition process. Another thing I learned from doing the IEEE standards work. So all this to say, at least what we find with Tricentis is that there's plenty of places where release management is supported. If you were just take the slice of testing is important. And I would also, might not be popular for everybody to say this, but I'm going to say this because it's true for me. I've had the pleasure of working with people in the industry such as James Bach that make a very clear point that testing, automated checks are not the same as testing. All testing is human. And so what we need to do is take the responsibility back about the human processes and say, what in that process of making sure that quality and risk is mitigated, that is a human decision. It is a human cognition on this thing. What of those activities are toil and should be turned into more automated things that can, yes, maybe live in a pipeline? And if they're not represented in a pipeline, how can we measure that they're effectively, especially with the small cycles that Dory was suggesting, is, things are getting quicker. And so the more things up in the air, the more balls up in the air, the shorter they are. How do we ensure that we're still making sure that we're complying with the risk and the risk tolerance of our organization at that level? I think it's both. You have to go faster, and speed changes everything, in order to get to a point where you're able to get to the sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs after your basic needs are met. Now you're thinking about what parts and processes in place need to be automated. So from a release management perspective, it does touch the transition process, but it also asks the question, what do we need to know as human beings to feel comfortable that we are ready to go from deploy, work seems to work so far, to release out to customers, and maybe not so much in a big bang situation, more progressively these days. And that's where we see things like Q-Test and Vera in high compliance organizations. We just released a new version of Vera that's kind of a layer on top of Q-Test that helps high compliance with things like auditability, traceability, longevity of data, approval processes, right? That's really important in things like health sciences, right? Life sciences and healthcare. So I see that it's relevant either way, right? You started with the test. We went, so the industry went a little too far as like QA is not necessary anymore. It's necessary more than ever. The faster we go, the more necessary it is to bake these processes in a way that those machines that we built, called computers, can help us with the toil of it. So, sorry, that was a long diatribe.
Actually, I highly resonate with what you say, Paul, and I think that one of the things that I see is that when I speak with executive, leaders in release management and DevOps, you always see that there is kind of the trade-off, right? They want to have the highest quality. In order to have the highest quality, you need to add more steps, as you said, right? You need more observability, more step, more static code analysis, more security tests, vulnerability, etc. And once you do that, you will prolong your build times, right? So it's a trade-off, right? It's kind of it's a compromise. I think that one of the important things that we need to be prepared for in that field is to make sure that our pipelines are wide enough in order to allow us not to compromise on the quality steps, and that's exactly the innovation that I believe that release managers are bringing to the field, is to kind of understand, where I must compromise, where I don't want to compromise. How do I bring more quality steps into that area? And I think connecting the pre-discussion that we have before starting this session about ChatGPT and all the AI writing code, that's just going to make things even more crazier than it is today, right? Because I speak with my colleagues, developers are already saying that 40% of their code is being generated by AI where they are using it. And that means that if you wrote your piece of code in 1 hour and you have 5-10 minutes, let's say, wait time for the build to run, now you can ship the same amount of code in 30 minutes. If you still have 10 minutes for wait time, then you become more inefficient in terms of the percentage that your wait time is taking from the entire time that you write your code. That's just one perspective. I'm sure the Tricentis is looking into all the amazing ways that AI can, answer the technical depth of unit testing, integration tests, all the things that no one loved to do, And in the future, I believe very near future, we are going to have tens thousands of tests that AI will generate. And, the important thing will be to understand, if I cannot run them all, right? If I run them in the cloud, like Tracy probably is doing, then it will cost me too much and it will take me too long. So I need to understand how to choose them. So I think that's really a changing. I think we are in the era where things are really changing in these roles and responsibilities. And I think AI is going to bring a lot of change into the role. And I think that people that adapt to change are the ones that survive. I think that release managers will need to adapt to change. But I think that people who thrive for change and they bring change to the organization, these are the people who lead. And I think that we have an amazing opportunity to bring and innovate around these pipelines. because that's affect the entire frequency of the organization. And that's a critical role in the organization, to have the right person who will drive innovation in that area. And I'm looking at our AAA studios. You cannot miss Christmas, right? Or as the entire revenue stream of the company is at risk. So they're risking. I think that's one of the most important roles I see in the R&D organizations today.
And I think that we do have to start looking at how best to manage code snippets, as we're talking about AI, because those code snippets are going to end up being in lots of little microservices. That's just how it's going to be. I know that we have a lot of people who are still doing big monolithic builds, but my prediction is that we worked really hard to create an agile process, and we worked really hard to have small incremental changes. But most people who are running builds do not have an incremental build process. And that is driving the decoupling these monoliths into smaller pieces and chunks that can be delivered across a really fast pipeline. And I think that code snippets and code generation will speed it all up. I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be an interesting process.
Pasted in the link to YouTube
We're not
video.
hearing you there. We're not hearing you, Alan, if you're speaking. Yeah.
That's okay. I'll speak for Alan. I'm just so going back to some of the topic around the pipeline stuff. To me, there is no one pipeline. There should be a value stream. I'm not saying you have to do value stream mapping, but in at least theory, just like architecture on a whiteboard, there's a purpose of a high level understanding and agreement, but the devil's in the details there. The value stream in an organization should be customer focused. This is why I go back to some of the core principles in the 32675, which is also an ISO IEC adopted standard now. It's not just IEEE. And in the study group before we got started, the ISO did a study group that identified, I'll mention 4, but I think there were 5 or 6 specific core principles of DevOps, tying it back to the whole nature of, this webinar isn't just about release management. It's also about like, well, how do we factor in this notion of DevOps? You got to ask yourself, what is DevOps? And I have a whole article later I can link to about my feelings about what I think DevOps is. It's more of a question than an answer. But at least from the ISO study group, they identified a couple characteristics, one of which was high degree of automation. Okay. How about everything is code, right? And it's not just the code of the binaries that you're shipping to run the software to manifest in operations. Or how about the packaging, right? Docker files, Helm charts, Kubernetes deployment manifests. That's code too, right? But it can be treated like code. Why? Because versioning and auditability and rollback and all that sort of great stuff. Peer review, pull requests and those kind of things. But one of the things that they identified in their survey from practitioners was that there were a lot of people who specifically said customer or value focus, right? One or the other, but it was essentially the same, similar answers. Customer focus, right? Customers, the value out to them. And so I go back to that question of like, how, even if it's always good to make your pipelines a little bit better. But there is no one pipeline. Your unit tests are always, hopefully always going to take a lot shorter of a time than your regression tests or, a big fat suite of UI tests that for some reason once a month you have to run. There are better ways to do that, right? We work with customers all the time to figure out a right fit when it makes sense to do these types of tests or that types of tests, or we've got, some things around like live compare does change impact analysis to help you understand which parts of big commercial off the shelf like SAP and other systems are worth testing as a priority because that's what changed. There are ways to not have to run all the quality gates like you used to run them. But going back to so that automated checks and testing and stuff like that, that's one topic. But I do want to kind of return and ask the panel, what are some things other than the example that I provided earlier about the EULA having to change, the end user license agreement? What are some other things that really are traditionally very tricky and still are tricky, that are very human-centric processes that have to be in place. They aren't necessarily just compliance driven, right? Any thoughts?
Database updates,
You mean
SQL
schemas,
statements,
this kind of thing?
key value pair changes. I could go on that topic.
What do you mean about
changes
database?
have been,
Like,
well, most
more.
of the time, DBAs like to manage their own process. So you have a release process, but you may have an update to a table, and it's not necessary that the update to the table is included in the CI/CD pipeline. So yes, there are human factors that have continually they've plagued us for years and years and years because of the need for control. And I think that DBAs are very picky about how database updates are done, and they don't want it to be in the CI/CD pipeline. So that's just one example of that. But something else that you mentioned, not all pipelines are the same. And before we run out of time, I want to just cover some things that I think that any release manager who's on this call might want to look at. First of all, CD events. CD events is the process of getting rid of pipeline workflow files where you're coding every single workflow, because most companies have hundreds of workflows that they have to update. You want to make a change to it corporate-wide, you have to make it to every single one. CD events, it's kind of like cloud events. It's triggered and it has a payload. It will change the way we do CI/CD. I think that you should be looking at GitOps. Yes, the whole idea of treating everything as code is critical, and versioning all of those scripts is important. GitOps is a really, really interesting way to manage the end targets by doing a check-in and doing release management by pull request. So I would encourage you to look at those two things. CD events, you can learn more at the CD Foundation, and GitOps, you can learn just about anywhere. There is going to be there's a show that combines CDCon and GitOps to have these discussions, but I think that's the direction that this community will be going in the future.
Tracy, have you ever heard of Captain? The Captain
Oh,
project?
of course. We work with Captain quite a bit.
Yeah, I was at a meetup last week with Andy Gradner, and I'm good friends with Henrik Rexed as well, as we all should be. I mean, these are great people and good advocates of especially the Captain project. But it was one of those things where in the early days, it was for some things, and then it became sort of like an orchestration platform. And unlike something like Argo CD, which has its own scope, right, is to get changes to manifest on your cluster, right? The notion of Captain orchestrations allows you to start to decouple from the traditional way to write a pipeline, even with parallel steps, is a very sequence of events, and not in a good way. Like, there are some things it makes sense to treat like, hey, this isn't waterfall, this is a sequence of events. But largely what I see is a lot of people writing pipelines that are very waterfall. And not just because this stage has to complete before that stage and so on and so forth. I mean, there's plenty of stages that could have been run in parallel before this one and aren't, because it just lends itself when you have to, even declarative. We have to
keep in mind where we started. We started with Jenkins, and Jenkins, not that the Jenkins is bad. Jenkins is actually adopting CD events. Yep. But those were the tools that we started with, and that stuff was really sticky. So, I was a programmer. I admit, if I needed to build something, I'd copy somebody's makefile. I'm sure we got people copying Jenkins pipelines all over the place. Mm-hmm. So it just became super sticky. And the only way to really disrupt that, what you're talking about, is for people to really step aside and say, okay, we're going to reevaluate how we're managing our pipelines, understand our new needs based on new architecture, and move forward. And one of those, I believe, will be CD events, because you're going to have literally thousands of microservices with different versions all the time. Yeah. You don't want a lot you don't want to have 4,000 or 5,000 pipelines. And I know companies that have 4,000 or 5,000 pipeline files that they're managing today. Yep. And it's just too much.
And it's almost like the paradigm, what I was setting up was this notion that, just like the old days, we only had really very imperative languages, things that would go from what, procedural and imperative languages and engines into something that's like, hey, functional programming languages. They lend themselves better to parallelism by the nature of some of the things like managing state in a different way. And that's what we were kind of seeing with the transition from, what was it, Node scripted pipelines that always started with Node in Jenkins, because it only could ever run on one particular thing because it didn't really handle state very well, to something that was more declarative, that at least the stages conceivably could be hydrated and dehydrated as necessary, so that there was some sort of failover capability on particular nodes and infrastructure. But it was this is surprisingly similar to what was it Stephen made the point, said, I'm trying to work with development teams. I think that's the compensation to done that developers often say, that they're really done. It's, you have to work with them. No, I'm just kidding. So he says, I'm trying to work with development teams to think on how we will release the change and then develop to that, rather than having to release based on how changes have been developed. And it's been a similar struggle with pipelines, is that we've written the pipelines to, and there's nothing wrong with starting somewhere. We used to do something here, and now we have more capabilities. Well, now we do have more capabilities. We have CD events, we have cloud events. This is a lot what another of the IEEE working group, his name is Sobrato, brought in as a concept of, we were talking about quality assurance processes also need to be able to sense and respond to project and team specific needs. If there's a team that likes to run hot and dangerous, it's not to put more guardrails in, it's to understand the nature of the team versus the nature of the organizational risk. And so the concept of sensing and responding. Well, in technical processes in a pipeline, I think that's what we're starting to see in terms of almost like asynchronous programming. It's like asynchronous pipelines. It's like saying, if I can describe, this is what needs to happen under these conditions about these types of things. And then when those types of things occur, like this binary that meets these tags and also has certain conditions applied to it, it should be able to run through that. That's a lot more like asynchronous programming, but for pipelines than anything else. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that develops.
No, we're not hearing you. Alan's trying to jump in here.
Go for it.
Not yet,
No.
Alan. No.
I think he's probably telling us we don't have much time left.
Wrap up for you, Alan.
We are going to have to, yes, we are almost at the top of the hour.
I think that one thing I wanted to just
let me take care of this so we get this in and we can kind of do our wrap up here. Okay. Cody has, we have 4 gift cards that we're giving away to our audience. So we announce those $25 Amazon gift card winners. Our 4 winners are Gus N, Flora I, Nathan S, and Rose G. So we will get a hold of the folks at Techstrong. We'll get a hold of you and let you know how you can get a hold of those gift cards. Alan, are you back with us? No. You're not. Don't know what happens. That's
the importance of release manager. You see, if we had a release manager, that wouldn't have happened.
Well, let's do. I'm going to do wrap up. Is that's okay, Alan? I think he's going to jump back in here. You know what? One of the things that I just want to make an observation, because I've really just been kind of soaking in everybody's thoughts and comments on this, is we have so many people in different places along the spectrum of how they're creating and delivering software, from I'm still living in the monolith world to I don't do incremental builds yet to I'm doing GitOps, or everything is declarative and bill of materials and definitions, make files and definitions of what the contents of my build are. It seems like to me that the definition of release management is really a cross-functional process that we have to look at, and the how it happens is very dependent, obviously, on sort of the deconstruction, the incrementalism, the smaller components of work and the delivery of that and the technology to do that. And that oftentimes is going to dictate how we have to deliver software, because it's dependent upon that capabilities. Whereas, as Emily H. said, kind of what you're delivering, the capability to the business of the end user is kind of an overlay to that. Whether one drives the other, you can argue, probably different in different organizations. So, are you back, Alan? Can we? No, we don't have his voice. Yeah, boy, big marker in Zoom.
Well, so that's something that I think the concept of DevOps as applied in organizations, not by tools or maybe by human tools, but not by tools or processes, but the proper synthesis of the end body problem, which is the people, process, and technology that need to change together. I think having a broader sense, such as customer focus and value, and the systems thinking, right? Like the fifth discipline from Peter Senge, that applies equally to that cross-functional nature of release management as well as DevOps. So I don't see these things at all in conflict with each other, unless the synthesis of a team to think DevOps is let's go fast and ignore all the things from the past. And I hope that as we usher in new people into an industry, that they see the faults, the massive number of faults of a lack of testing, a lack of quality assurance, a lack of security or privacy constraints, right? That they see what's happened in the industry, and as new people, they go, well, maybe we can learn our lessons from the people before us, as opposed to just bang our heads against the wall. Like I feel like
that's the
generations
human factor,
of
Paul.
done.
That's
What's
exactly the human factor. That's exactly the human factor. That's not something automation will ever be able to replace. The ability to understand, to see, to investigate, to surface things, to innovate, to choose the right tools. As you said, when you need to compromise on which test to run, to understand, what's the priorities, what are the teams. That's something that will always require the human element.
Yeah.
Alan, are you back with us, buddy? No, we're not hearing you. What? Sorry, I don't know what it is. So, Tracy, why don't you give us the final word, and we'll sign off from our conversation today.
Well, I would say it is time to take a close look at what you're doing in release management. Look to your future direction, what your organization plans. If it's moving, it's changing its architecture. If it's moving out of monolith and getting into a more decoupled cloud native architecture, and really start thinking about how your pipelines are going to be disrupted. The sooner you do that, the better off you'll be. We still need release management. It's just going to look different. And now's the time to really start evaluating what changes you need to make. And if you do anything, don't go back into something that's, highly scripted. Try to reduce the number of scripts so that when you are moving into more of these decoupled environments, you don't have these thousands of pipeline scripts sitting around, because it's just not going to serve your needs in the future.
Yeah, I think that will have to be our last word. Alan, we miss hearing from you. So, thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to Tracy.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. It was a great discussion.
Producing today's event. And be sure and listen to this and other episodes on DevOpsUnboundPodcast.com, as well as on Techstrong.tv. There's a lot of other episodes of great topics like this, and we'll be bringing you more. So thank you to Tracy, Paul, Dory, and of course, on behalf of Alan and myself, and also thank you to Lanier and Jody for our executive producing of the show today, and all the production folks that helped put this on. So we hope you all be well, and hope you've enjoyed today's show. We'll see you back again soon for another roundtable and more episodes on Techstrong.tv.